The rain hit the pavement like 1,000 tiny bullets. Grace Bennet clutched her worn leather bag tighter as she sprinted down the crowded sidewalk, heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She couldn't afford to miss this interview, and it was her last shot after a string of failures that felt like a lifetime of bad luck. She darted between umbrellas, her sneakers slipping on the glossy ground, the skyscraper ahead gleaming like a fortress she wasn't sure she belonged to. But she had to try. Her foot caught a loose tile, and before she could curse, she crashed down hard into a murky puddle. Water and mud splashed in every direction, soaking her jeans, smearing her blouse, and matting her hair to her forehead. Gasps and murmured laughter rippled through the crowd. Humiliation burned through her veins, hotter than the coffee she'd skipped that morning. Grace pushed herself up, feeling every pair of eyes carving judgment into her back. At the edge of the sidewalk, a sleek black car idled. Behind its tinted windows sat Ethan Hayes, CEO of Hayes Industries, known for his ruthless ambition and ice-cold precision. He watched her fall, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his chiseled features. His driver muttered something, but Ethan said nothing, just kept his gaze locked on the girl, who was now wiping sludge off her face with the sleeve of her jacket. Grace didn't see him watching. She didn't see anything except the revolving glass doors, spinning ahead like a portal to another world, one she had no business entering in her current state. For a moment, she stood frozen, half tempted to turn around and disappear into the storm, pretend this never happened. But then she remembered the eviction notice taped to her fridge, the overdue bills, the aching emptiness that had settled in her chest over the past year. No, she was done running. With a shaky breath, Grace squared her shoulders and marched toward the entrance. People parted like the Red Sea, giving her a wide berth as if mud were contagious. The receptionist's lips curled into a smirk when she saw her. "Name?" she asked, already bracing herself to send this mess away. "Grace Bennet," she answered, voice steady, chin lifted. If she was going to fail, she'd do it standing tall. The waiting area was a sea of polished suits, manicured nails, and high-end perfumes. Grace sank into a corner chair, feeling every stain on her clothes scream out. She caught glimpses of perfectly styled candidates side-eyeing her, whispering, behind glossy resumes. One woman even scooted 2 seats over with a theatrical cough. Grace bit her lip to keep from laughing. It was either that or cry, and she refused to cry. Then the elevator dinged. Ethan Hayes stepped out like he owned the universe. Sharp suit, sharper gaze. He moved through the lobby with the kind of presence that made even the walls seem to straighten up. His eyes swept the room once, dispassionate and cool, before landing almost imperceptibly on Grace. There was the briefest hesitation, a glitch in his perfect rhythm. Then he moved on without a word. Grace's heart thudded painfully. She didn't recognize him. Not really, just registered that he was someone important, someone terrifyingly out of reach. She muttered under her breath, "Another one who thinks mud is beneath him." She wasn't wrong, but she also wasn't entirely right. Ethan walked into his office, but he didn't forget the girl in the lobby, not even close. One by one, names were called. Candidates disappeared behind the glass doors and returned, looking crushed or furious. Grace waited, feeling the wetness seep deeper into her skin, feeling the weight of every wasted hour and shattered hope pressing down on her shoulders. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe she should have just gone home, dried off, and cried in peace. Finally, the receptionist called her name, or something close to it, mangling Bennett into B-net. Grace stood, every muscle stiff, and walked toward the unknown. The glass doors swallowed her whole, and suddenly it was just her and Ethan. Hayes, seated behind a monolithic desk like a king in a courtroom. He looked up slowly. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, not quite mockery. "Miss Bennett," he said, voice like a smooth blade. "You're aware you look like you fought a war with a puddle. and lost. Grace fought the urge to shrink. "I'm aware," she said, "but I'm also here, which is more than I can say for half your candidates who probably ran home the second a drop of rain hit their hair." Ethan leaned back, studying her as if she were a problem he might enjoy solving. "Bold," he murmured, "or desperate?" Grace lifted an eyebrow. "Can't I be both?" That earned the smallest flicker of amusement. He closed the laptop in front of him with a soft click and steepled his fingers, elbows on the desk. "Tell me, Miss Bennet," Ethan said, voice dropping just enough to feel dangerous, "why should I even consider you when you're sitting here soaked, stained, and, let's be honest, smelling like the wrong end of a rainstorm?" Grace smiled, slow and fearless. "Because while everyone else looks perfect on paper, I'm the only one who already proved I can stand back up when life knocks me down." For the first time in a very long time, Ethan Hayes felt the faintest crack in his armor. Something stirred, something he thought he'd buried beneath ambition and isolation. He tapped his pen once against the desk. A sharp, thoughtful sound. "Interesting," he said. "Very interesting." Grace didn't know if that was good or bad. She didn't care. She'd shown up, she'd fought through the humiliation, and she'd faced the king without flinching. No matter what happened next, she'd leave with her dignity intact. Ethan's gaze lingered a second longer before he said, "You'll hear from us soon." His tone gave nothing away. Grace nodded once, turned and walked out, leaving a trail of muddy footprints on the pristine marble floor. Behind her, Ethan watched. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he smiled. Grace sat in the coffee shop across the street, her hands wrapped around a chipped porcelain mug as she stared blankly at the rain outside. She hadn't even ordered anything yet, just needed to sit somewhere and not fall apart. The reality of what had just happened hit her harder now than it had when she was standing in front of Ethan Hayes. She had faced him. She had survived. But what came next was an emptiness she hadn't prepared for. The barista gave her a sympathetic smile as he cleared the next table, probably assuming she'd just been dumped or fired. Grace almost laughed at the thought. She hadn't even been hired yet. In the back of her mind, the ugly voice whispered, "You made a fool of yourself. They'll never call." She tightened her grip on the mug until her knuckles turned white, willing herself not to listen, not today. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize flashed on the screen. For a moment she considered ignoring it, letting the world forget her, but something inside her, stubborn and raw, pushed her to answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice tight with exhaustion. "Miss Bennet?" a clipped voice said on the other end. "This is Eleanor Crane from Hayes Industries. Mr. Hayes would like you to return for a secondary interview tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp." Grace blinked. Tomorrow? Secondary interview? Sharp? It took her a second to find her voice. "Yes," she managed. "I'll be there, thank you." She hung up and stared at the phone, as if it might start laughing at her. Across the rainy street, the monolith of Hayes Industries loomed, cold and unreachable. Yet somehow she had been invited. Back inside, sleep didn't come easy that night. Grace tossed and turned, every muscle in her body aching from tension. Her mind raced with doubts, plans, imaginary conversations, where she sounded smarter, sharper, less like a drowned rat. She scribbled notes on a torn notebook, potential questions, strategies, reminders to not trip and faceplant into Ethan Hayes's desk. When dawn broke, she was more exhausted than when she'd closed her eyes. She had exactly one clean outfit, a navy skirt and a plain cream blouse, both salvaged from the depths of her closet. They didn't scream executive material, but they also didn't scream street urchin, which felt like progress. She pinned her hair back, forced a small smile in the mirror, and whispered to herself, "You deserve to be there. Walk like it." The lobby was quieter this time. The storm passed, leaving behind a city that glistened in the pale morning light. Grace checked in with the same receptionist, who arched an eyebrow but said nothing. The elevator ride up felt endless, her reflection, in the mirrored walls, growing more and more unfamiliar with each passing second. Was she really doing this? Was she really about to sit across from that man again? The conference room where she was led smelled like leather and money. A long glass table stretched from one end to the other, surrounded by high-backed chairs that looked more like thrones. Grace perched on the edge of one, knees tightly pressed together, hands folded to hide the tremor in her fingers. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here, not yet. When Ethan entered, he did so without ceremony, but somehow the air shifted anyway. He wore a different suit, charcoal grey this time, but the same unreadable expression. He took his seat at the head of the table, not looking at her immediately, flipping through a folder instead. Grace recognized her resume, crinkled at the corners from the day before. She swallowed hard. "Miss Bennett," he said at last, setting the folder down with a soft thud. "I took the liberty of reviewing your background more closely." His eyes met hers, sharp and calculating. "It's unconventional." Grace bristled but kept her tone even. "That's a polite way of saying it's a mess." The corner of his mouth twitched. "I prefer to think of it as non-traditional." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers again. "Tell me," he said, "why did you really come back yesterday after that fall? Most people would have fled." Grace inhaled slowly. This was it, the heart of everything. "Because," she said, her voice steadying with each word, "I don't believe that a setback defines you. Only what you do afterward does." For a long, heartbeat-stretching moment, Ethan said nothing. He just watched her, the gears in his mind almost visible behind those glacial eyes. Finally he nodded once, a movement so slight it barely qualified as a gesture. "I'm offering you a probationary position," he said, "assistant to my executive operations manager. You'll shadow meetings, prep documents, handle communications. It's demanding, unforgiving. You will likely fail at least once." Grace's mouth went dry. She waited for the but that would surely follow. Ethan continued, "If you fail smartly, if you adapt, you might just survive here." His voice softened by a fraction. "And survival is more valuable than perfection." Grace felt her chest tighten, a strange mix of fear and fierce pride swirling in her ribcage. "I'll survive," she said simply. He stood, gathering his papers. "Good," he said over his shoulder. "You start Monday, 7 a.m. Don't be late." And then just like that he was gone, leaving Grace alone in the cavernous room, the hum of the city far below her feet. She sat there for another minute, letting it sink in. She had done it. She was in. When she finally rose, her knees wobbled. Slightly, but her heart was stronger than it had been in months. As she crossed the lobby again, the receptionist didn't even look up. The world outside had no idea what had just happened. No one cheered, no music played, but Grace smiled to herself anyway, because sometimes the biggest victories were the ones no one else saw. Grace showed up on Monday 15 minutes early, nerves buzzing so hard they made her hands clumsy. She wore her cleanest clothes, a navy blazer she borrowed from a friend and a skirt she ironed at midnight until her arms ached. As she entered the gleaming lobby, she caught a glimpse of herself in the polished elevator doors. She looked small, determined but undeniably small. The elevator ride felt endless again, but this time she was filled with a different kind of energy, not fear, but resolve. She could feel it in her spine, a quiet promise she made to herself. She wasn't going to let anyone define her place here except her own work. Not the whispers, not the stares, not even Ethan Hayes. When the doors opened, Grace was met by Eleanor Crane, the same clipped-voice woman from the call. Eleanor was tall, impeccably dressed, and had a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "You're early," Eleanor said, more an accusation than a compliment. Grace simply nodded. "Better early than sorry," she said, and earned a brief, reluctant smile from Eleanor. She was shown to a small desk just outside Ethan's office, a position that felt both strategic and cruel. It was a place of exposure, where everyone passing, I could see her every fumble, every mistake. Grace ran a hand down her skirt, straightening invisible wrinkles, and inhaled slowly. Let them watch, she thought. She had survived worse. The morning began at a sprint. Files were dumped on her desk with minimal explanation, emails flooded in faster than she could read, and Eleanor barked updates from across the room like a drill sergeant. Grace scrambled, her fingers trembling slightly on the keyboard, but she forced herself to breathe, to focus, to move. Mid-morning, Ethan exited his office with the casual grace of someone who owned time itself. He glanced at her desk, chaos disguised as organization, and said, "Walk with me." No greeting, no instructions, just a command. Grace grabbed a notepad and hurried after him, almost knocking over a potted plant in the process. He moved fast through the hallways, his stride devouring distance. Grace struggled to keep up, jotting down notes as he dictated changes to reports, follow-ups for meetings, adjustments to presentations. His words were precise, clipped, like arrows shot from a practiced hand. Every now and then he glanced over his shoulder to see if she was still breathing. After 20 minutes, he finally stopped outside a glass-walled conference room. Inside, two senior managers were arguing over a quarterly report. Ethan turned to her. "Tell me," he said, voice low, "what's wrong with this picture?" Grace blinked, thrown by the question. She peered into the room, watching the men's frantic gestures, the messy charts on the screen, the lack of structure. "They're fighting symptoms instead of fixing the disease," she said without thinking. Ethan's mouth twitched, just slightly. "Good," he murmured. "Very good." And then he left her standing there, confused but strangely proud, as he entered the room and dismantled the entire conversation in 3 sentences flat. The rest of the day didn't get any easier. Grace spilled coffee on her own notes, tripped over a misplaced briefcase, and accidentally sent an unfinished email to an entire executive thread. Each mistake was a gut punch, a fresh reminder that she was out of her depth. Yet, somehow, she kept going. Eleanor hovered like a hawk, her comments clipped and occasionally brutal. "Double-check before you hit send," she snapped after the email fiasco. Grace bit back a retort, choosing instead to nod and fix it. Pride wouldn't save her here, only perseverance would. When the clock hit 6, Grace finally slumped back in her chair, the world spinning slightly. Her back ached, her eyes burned, and she was pretty sure her right heel was bleeding. She wanted to cry, to scream, to crawl into bed and never leave. But when she looked at the tiny pile of completed tasks on her desk, she felt a flicker of triumph. Ethan passed by, hands in his pockets, looking like he owned every breath of air on the floor. He paused, glanced at her desk, then at her. "Not bad," he said simply. Then, after a beat, he added almost too quietly, "Not bad at all." Before she could respond, he was gone. Grace sat there for a moment, stunned. Was that a compliment? From Ethan Hayes? She let out a shaky laugh, the tension in her chest easing by a fraction. Maybe she hadn't completely crashed and burned, after all. As she gathered her things to leave, she noticed a post-it stuck to the edge of her desk. In neat, almost mechanical handwriting, it read, "Survival is step 1. Strength comes next." There was no signature, but she knew exactly who it was from. Grace tucked the note into her notebook, her fingers lingering on the paper. Maybe Ethan Hayes wasn't made of ice after all. Or maybe he was, but he recognized the fire when he saw it. Either way, she wasn't leaving. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not until she built something bigger than fear. Something stronger than the mud that once clung to her shoes. And maybe, if she was brave enough, something that could reach even the coldest corners of Ethan Hayes's guarded heart. By the end of her second week, Grace understood that Hayes Industries was a battlefield disguised as an office. Every smile carried a blade behind it, and every compliment was a calculated move. Success wasn't just about skill here. It was about survival among sharks who circled the smallest drop of weakness. And Grace, still finding her footing, was bleeding opportunity. Without even realizing it, her desk, once neatly organized, was now cluttered with files nobody else wanted to touch. Requests piled up under the guise of, "Can you just handle this?" from employees who barely acknowledged her otherwise. Eleanor, in particular, seemed to relish in handing off impossible tasks while offering smiles sharp enough to cut skin. Ethan, for his part, remained an enigma. He passed by Grace's desk several times a day, never stopping long enough for small talk, but always sparing a glance. A silent acknowledgement that left her heart stuttering in ways she refused to examine. Too closely, it was maddening and strangely comforting at once. One afternoon, while delivering a corrected project report to Ethan's office, Grace caught sight of something unusual. His normally pristine desk was littered with old, yellowed papers. One photo lay face up among the clutter, a young boy, maybe 10 years old, standing proudly next to a much younger Ethan. There was a warmth in the boy's grin, a life Ethan now seemed to keep buried. Before she could look longer, Ethan's voice snapped her out of it. "Leave it on the desk," he said without looking up. His tone was curt, but not cruel. Grace obeyed, her mind swirling with questions she knew better than to ask. For now. Outside the office, Eleanor was waiting like a cat at a mouse hole. "Word of advice," she said, her voice deceptively friendly. "Don't get too comfortable. In there, Hayes notices everything, and he forgets nothing." Grace blinked, unsure how much was threat and how much was warning. Either way, she nodded and walked away, spine stiff. Later that day, during a departmental briefing, Grace experienced her first real corporate ambush. She had compiled data for a presentation, hours of grueling research, only to watch Eleanor subtly take credit for it in front of the senior staff. Grace's stomach twisted, but she kept her face neutral, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Ethan sat at the head of the table, impassive, unreadable. He didn't call Eleanor out. He didn't defend Grace. He just watched. It stung more than she expected, and afterward she hid in the copy room under the pretense of fixing a paper jam, fighting down the humiliation that clawed at her throat. When the door swung open and Ethan walked in, she almost dropped the toner cartridge. He stood there for a moment, as if weighing something invisible between them. Then he said, without preamble, "You let her steal credit for your work." Grace froze, caught between defensiveness and shame. "I didn't want to cause a scene," she muttered. "Scenes are what get remembered," Ethan said quietly. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You think playing it safe will save you here? It won't. All it will do is bury you where no one bothers to dig you out." Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not anger, but a hard-earned truth etched into every line of his face. She started, but the words faltered. "I'm tired of fighting everyone all the time." Ethan's mouth twitched into something almost like a smile, sad, sardonic. "Then fight smarter. Fight like someone who's already lost once and knows better than to let it happen again." It was the closest thing to advice she'd ever heard him give. And something about the way he said it, the heaviness behind it, made her wonder just how many battles Ethan Hayes had fought and lost before he learned to wear his armor so well. After he left, Grace sat down on the floor among piles of paper and thought about what surviving really meant. It wasn't just about staying on your feet. It was about choosing when to speak, when to push, when to let them think they'd won. Strength comes next, she reminded herself, fingering the post-it note still tucked into her notebook. That night, long after the building emptied, Grace stayed behind organizing files, rewriting reports, and fixing mistakes she didn't make, quietly, methodically. Somewhere around midnight, as she stacked folders neatly into a drawer, she found a small envelope taped inside. Inside was a simple card with no name, no message, just a quote. "In a room full of echoes, be the voice that doesn't fade." She stared at it for a long time, the noise of the empty office buzzing in her ears. Ethan Hayes might never say it aloud, but Grace could feel it now. He was watching. He was testing, maybe even hoping she'd be the one voice that didn't fade into the static of ambition and fear. And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt something close to hope flicker to life inside her. The days that followed were a study in quiet endurance. Grace became a shadow of the company's heartbeat, unnoticed by many, indispensable to a few. She moved through the halls with steady steps, her presence growing like ivy, stubborn and unseen, until it wrapped around everything. And though no one said it aloud, the office began to shift around her. Ethan continued to orbit her world in strange, unpredictable ways. Sometimes he would pass by her desk without a word, merely dropping a file or scribbled instructions. Other times he would call her into his office under flimsy pretexts just to discuss strategy, conversations that veered into philosophy when neither of them was watching too closely. On a Tuesday afternoon, after a brutal budget review, Ethan summoned her with a short, clipped message: "Bring coffee and patience." Grace showed up minutes later, 2 cups in hand, trying not to look too amused. He accepted the coffee with a nod, his sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, looking more human than she had ever seen him. He gestured to the seat across from his desk. "Sit," he said, but his tone was less command and more invitation. Grace obeyed, feeling strangely nervous. They sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee, the city humming just outside the towering windows. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Tell me," he said, voice low, "what's the worst mistake you ever made?" Grace blinked, caught off guard. "In life?" she asked. "In anything," he said. "Something you regret, something you'd undo if you could." The question wasn't casual. It came weighted, pulled from somewhere deep. Grace stared at her coffee, thinking. So many mistakes, some small, some colossal, but one surfaced without permission. "Trusting someone who said they'd catch me," she said quietly, "and believing them, even when everything inside me knew better." She didn't look up, afraid of what she might find on his face. Ethan was silent for a long time. When she finally glanced up, his eyes were distant, stormy. "We all have our ruins," he murmured. "The trick is learning how to build on them instead of living inside them." Grace's throat tightened. Was he speaking to her, or about himself? Before she could answer, Eleanor stormed into the office without knocking, her tablet clutched like a weapon. "Sir, there's an issue with the Crestview proposal. They're threatening to pull out." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Handle it," he said, sharply. Eleanor hesitated, her eyes flicking to Grace with poorly concealed disdain. "Do you want her involved?" Eleanor asked, deliberately icy. Ethan didn't miss the barb. He turned to Grace, surprising them both. "Yes, I trust her judgment." Eleanor flinched like she'd been slapped. Grace sat frozen, the words ricocheting around her skull. "I trust her judgment." The meeting that followed was brutal. Crestview's legal team was vicious, their demands unrealistic. Grace watched Ethan in action, a controlled firestorm of calm pressure, strategic concessions, and razor-sharp persuasion. It was like watching a masterclass in survival without losing one's soul. At one point, When tensions reached a fever pitch, Ethan leaned back in his chair, glanced at Grace and said, "Thoughts?" The table fell silent. All eyes turned to her, some amused, some incredulous. Grace's heart stuttered, but she forced herself to breathe. She scanned the documents spread before them, saw what others missed. "They're bluffing," she said. "They can't afford to walk away. Not with their current liabilities. They need us more than we need them." Ethan smiled. Not wide, not warm, but real. "Exactly," he said. And just like that, the balance shifted. After the meeting, as the team dispersed, Grace lingered behind to gather the scattered documents. Ethan leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her. "You have good instincts," he said simply. Grace tucked a stray hair behind her ear, heat creeping up her neck. "Thanks," she said, "but instincts don't always save you." "No," he agreed, "but they teach you when to run and when to stand your ground." Their eyes met, something heavy passing between them. Recognition, maybe. A silent admission that both of them had stood their ground against storms far bigger than office politics. Later that evening, as Grace left the building under a sky heavy with stars, she found herself smiling despite the exhaustion. The city stretched before her, glittering and endless, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was fighting alone, but she knew better than to believe the fight was over. In places like Hayes Industries, victories were rented, not owned, and somewhere in the shadows, resentment was already gathering, like a storm waiting to break. Grace squared her shoulders and kept walking. Let it come, she thought. She was ready. By the third month, Grace noticed it. The subtle, invisible, war unfolding around her. Whispers grew sharper, smiles tighter. Some people who once greeted her now barely nodded. Eleanor's glances turned more frequent, more cutting, as if Grace's mere existence was an affront to an unspoken hierarchy. It wasn't just Eleanor. Other forces moved too. Departments she'd never even worked with began finding fault in projects she touched. A misfiled document, a missing initial, a budget request delayed for mysterious reasons. Little things that, stacked carefully, built the case of someone not fitting in. Grace didn't complain. She adapted, adjusting her footing like a sailor, learning to ride out a gathering storm. She worked longer hours, triple-checked every file, documented every instruction. Still, the walls were closing in inch by inch. She wasn't paranoid, she was paying attention. One evening, long after the sun sank behind the city's skyline, Grace stayed late to finish a quarterly report Ethan needed. The office was ghostly, quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights the only sound. She stood to stretch when she noticed something strange. Her desk drawer was ajar. She always kept it locked. Inside, her files were subtly rearranged, and one was missing entirely. Heart. Hammering, she scanned the room. Empty, only the cleaning crew 2 floors down. She locked the drawer again, double-checked it, but the knot in her stomach tightened. Someone was sabotaging her, and they were getting bold. The next morning, she found herself called into a small, windowless room on the 3rd floor. The kind used for HR investigations. Waiting for her were 2 people she didn't recognize, and Eleanor, sitting primly with a folder in her lap. "Miss Bennett," said one of the strangers, "we have concerns regarding a recent breach of data." "Protocol." Grace's blood turned to ice. "I don't understand," she said carefully. Eleanor slid the folder across the table. "A confidential financial document was found in your desk, unauthorized." Grace opened the folder and felt the world tilt. It was the missing file from last night. Panic threatened to claw its way up her throat, but she forced it down. "I didn't take this," she said, voice steady. "Someone went through my things." The HR officer gave her a neutral look that said, "Sure you didn't." Eleanor, of course, looked appropriately grave, as if this pained her greatly. "I suggest you think very carefully before proceeding," Eleanor said softly. Mistakes happen, but cover-ups make things worse. Grace's mind raced. If she accused Eleanor without proof, she would look desperate. If she said nothing, the implication would stain her permanently. After what felt like an eternity, Grace stood. I have nothing to confess, she said, spine straight, and if you want to accuse me formally, I'll need representation. Eleanor's smile was thin, almost admiring. Noted, she said, closing the folder with a snap. When Grace returned to her desk shaking with silent rage, Ethan was waiting by the elevator. One look at her face, and he knew something was wrong. Walk with me, he said, voice low. She followed, too stunned to argue. They ended up on the rooftop, the city sprawling out before them, wind tugging at Grace's hair. Ethan leaned against the railing, studying her carefully. What happened? He asked. She told him everything, the missing file, the ambush, Eleanor's poised attack. His face darkened with every word. You know what this is, he said finally. Someone's trying to make you fall. Publicly. Grace nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. And if I fall quietly, they win. Ethan turned to face her fully, his jaw clenched. You don't fall quietly, he said, not you. The words hit harder than she expected. Grace blinked rapidly, embarrassed by the sting in her eyes. I don't know how to fight this, she admitted. Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice to something almost intimate. Then we fight it together. A gust of wind swept across the rooftop, carrying away the tension for just a moment. In that space, standing inches apart, something unspoken passed between them. A silent pact forged not of promises, but of shared defiance. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for each other. As they headed back, down, Grace felt lighter but also acutely aware of the battle ahead. Hayes Industries didn't tolerate weakness. It smelled it, it devoured it, and now it smelled blood. Hers. But for the first time, Grace knew she wasn't standing alone. And that, maybe, would make all the difference. The investigation didn't die quietly. Over the next few days, whispers became walls. Silence became suspicion. Wherever Grace walked, she felt it. The invisible trail of glances, the low murmurs that stopped the moment she entered a room. She wasn't paranoid. She was being hunted. Eleanor kept her distance now, smiling too much, speaking too little. It was a different kind of weapon, the calm before an inevitable storm. Grace spent her days documenting everything, archiving every task, every email, every request. She built her own fortress out of paper and quiet fury. Ethan grew colder in public, as if sensing the vultures circling and knowing he couldn't show any favoritism. Their brief conversations were clipped, professional. But behind closed doors, in stolen moments between meetings, he was different, watching her, protecting her even when he didn't say it. One evening, Grace found a flash drive left anonymously on her desk. No note, no hint, just a small black device almost invisible against the wood grain. For a moment, she hesitated, heart pounding. Then she slipped it into her pocket and left the building without looking back. In her tiny apartment with trembling hands, she plugged the drive into her laptop. It contained only one folder. Inside, dozens of screenshots, emails, messages, forged approvals. And at the center of it all, Eleanor's name, neatly tied to every falsification. Grace covered her mouth to muffle a gasp. It was worse than she'd imagined. Eleanor hadn't just tried to sabotage her. She had been orchestrating small collapses across departments for months, making herself look indispensable by engineering. Chaos she could fix. Grace wasn't the only target. She was just the most visible one. Beneath the anger, fear twisted like a knife. Whoever sent her this had access to dangerous information. If Eleanor found out Grace had it, retaliation would come hard and fast. Grace stared at the screen, knowing she had two choices: expose the truth or walk away and save herself. The next morning, she barely slept. She printed the screenshots, carefully hidden inside a hollowed-out notebook. She needed advice, real advice, not from HR, not from the whispering hallways. There was only one person she trusted, even if she shouldn't: Ethan Hayes. When she slipped into his office, he was on a call. One look at her face, though, and he ended it mid-sentence. "Problem?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Wordlessly, Grace slid the hollowed notebook across his desk. Ethan opened it, flipping through the pages with increasing tension in his jaw. When he looked up, his expression wasn't shock. It was something colder. "I knew," he said quietly. "I suspected anyway. I just didn't have proof." Grace frowned. "You knew she was doing this?" Ethan leaned back, eyes dark. "Not to you, but to others. I didn't think she'd be stupid enough to come after someone under my direct command." The room was charged now, crackling with unsaid things. Grace felt the words bubbling up, questions about trust, about power, about why he hadn't warned her. But she bit them back. Survival first, vindication later. "What do we do?" she asked. Ethan's mouth twisted into a humorless smile. "We prepare," he said, "and we wait, because when people like Eleanor feel the ground slip beneath them, they don't go quietly, they burn everything on the way down." That night, Grace barely made it home before the fear hit. Real fear. Not the creeping anxiety of whispers or the sharp sting of humiliation. This was the kind that curled in your gut and made every shadow look like a threat. She paced her living room until the city lights blurred into meaningless streaks outside her window. At midnight, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She froze. 1 ring, 2, 3. Finally she answered. Silence on the other end. Then a voice. She knew too well, Eleanor's, silky and sharp. "You should watch where you step, Grace," she said. "Not all falls are accidents." The line went dead. Grace stood there, phone still pressed to her ear, heart hammering so loudly she thought it might break her ribs. She wasn't just fighting for a job anymore. She was fighting for something much more fragile, her future, and she had no intention of losing. The next morning, the building buzzed with a strange electric energy. Grace felt it the moment she stepped through the revolving doors, like a storm brewing under the surface. People watched her without bothering to hide it now, whispers snapping through the air like brittle twigs underfoot. Ethan wasn't at his office. His assistant said he was in a closed-door meeting with senior management. Grace's stomach knotted. Meetings like that never meant good news. She gripped her bag tighter and walked quickly to her desk, eyes burning with the effort of not reacting. Midway through the morning, a mass email went out. Mandatory staff assembly at 11 a.m. 15th floor. Auditorium. Attendance required. No subject line, no explanation. Grace stared at it, heart pounding. She knew this wasn't random. Whatever was coming, it had her name written all over it. The auditorium filled fast, rows of employees packed. Into the seats, a low murmur rising like distant thunder. Grace sat near the back, her hands cold despite the room's stale warmth. Eleanor stood near the stage, composed and radiant, like a queen ready to watch a public execution. The CEO's advisory board entered first, faces solemn. Then Ethan, flanked by 2 board members, jaw tight, gaze unreadable. He didn't look at Grace, not once. That alone nearly undid her. For a wild moment she thought, "He's abandoning me." The thought hurt more than she cared to admit. A man Grace didn't recognize, legal counsel, she guessed, took the podium. "Recent concerns have been raised about breaches of protocol," he began, his voice smooth and cold. "Hayes Industries holds its employees to the highest standard. As such, allegations of misconduct will be addressed swiftly and transparently." Beside him, Eleanor's smile sharpened. The trap was closing. Grace's breathing grew shallow. This wasn't about process. It was about spectacle. They wanted her humiliated, visible punishment to feed the sharks circling the company's reputation. The man continued, "Miss Grace Bennett, please step forward." Heads turned, chairs creaked. Grace stood, legs trembling, and walked toward the stage. Each step felt like wading through concrete. She forced her shoulders back, forced her head up, forced herself not to shatter. When she reached the front, the man smiled thinly. "Evidence has surfaced suggesting negligence and inappropriate access to sensitive financial information." A ripple of gasps. Eleanor tilted her head as if waiting for Grace to crumple, but she didn't, not yet. "Before we proceed," the man said almost casually, "Mr. Hayes has requested the floor." Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Grace turned her head, and there was Ethan stepping forward, hands clasped behind his back, every inch the unshakable CEO. But his eyes, when they found hers, were not cold. Ethan's voice, when it came, was calm and lethal. "I have personally reviewed the evidence," he said, "and I have discovered additional information suggesting that Miss Bennett is not the perpetrator, but the target of an internal sabotage campaign." The room erupted into shocked murmurs. Eleanor's composure cracked for the first time, a flash of rage before it was masked again. Grace could hardly breathe. Was this real? Was he really choosing to stand with her? Publicly? Irrevocably? Ethan continued. "Effective immediately. An independent investigation will be launched into the actions of Eleanor Crane and associated parties. Until that time, Miss Bennett will remain under my direct supervision. Any retaliation or intimidation against her will result in immediate termination." The advisory board shifted, some nodding, some scowling, but none dared oppose him now. Grace stared at Ethan, her throat too tight for words. He had put his own reputation, his own control, on the line for her, without hesitation. The assembly dispersed in stunned silence. Eleanor stormed out, phone already pressed to her ear. Grace remained frozen for a moment longer, the roar of blood in her ears, drowning out everything else. Then Ethan was beside her, close enough for only her to hear. "Survival," he murmured, his breath brushing her ear. "Step 1. Remember." Grace swallowed hard, a smile breaking free against her will. "Strength comes next," she whispered back. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel like prey anymore. She felt like a fighter. And this fight was far from over. The aftermath of the assembly was a battlefield fought in whispers and glances. Grace could feel it in every hallway she crossed, every conference room she entered. She was no longer invisible, but she was also no longer safe. She was a symbol, now, of rebellion, of exposure, and symbols made easy targets. Eleanor was gone, suspended pending investigation. But her influence lingered like a poison cloud. Some employees still looked at Grace with suspicion, others with pity. Worse were those who smiled at her, thin-lipped and calculating already, recalibrating their alliances for the new regime Ethan had just publicly declared. Ethan himself was more distant than ever, professional, careful. Their interactions became brief nods, clipped orders. Whatever silent bond had passed between them on the rooftop and in the assembly hall was buried now under layers of necessity and unspoken fear. Grace hated it more than she could say. Late one evening, when most of the office had emptied out, Grace found a plain envelope on her desk. No markings, no sender. She opened it carefully, heart sinking as she read the contents. An anonymous warning. "Walk away, or next time it won't just be your job on the line." She crushed the letter in her fist, fury rising. Fear was their weapon. Fear was how they kept people small, compliant. She had lived too much of her life bending under threats. She wasn't going back to that. Not now, not ever. She threw the letter into the trash, refusing to let it dictate her. Still, The unease clung to her all evening. She left the office, late, the streets empty and humming with danger. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, keys gripped like a blade between her fingers. Every shadow seemed heavier now, every footstep behind her suspicious. When she finally reached her apartment building, she nearly jumped out of her skin when a figure stepped from the darkness. Ethan, hands deep in his coat pockets. Face half lit by the street lamp, he looked almost human, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "You shouldn't walk alone this late," he said simply, his voice low. Grace exhaled, half laughing, half crying from the adrenaline crash. "I'm not the type to scare easily," she said. Ethan's gaze flicked to the street behind her, sharp and assessing. "You should be." She led him inside without thinking. They rode the elevator in silence, the old machinery groaning under their weight. When they reached her door, Grace hesitated, fumbling for the key. Ethan placed a hand over hers, light, steady. "You're not alone in this," he said, voice rougher than usual. The words cracked something inside her. She swallowed hard, blinking, fast. "I know," she whispered. But knowing didn't erase the fear or the growing awareness that everything around them, everything between them, was becoming more dangerous by the second. Inside, her apartment was small but warm, filled with mismatched furniture and books piled in corners. Ethan looked around, taking it in. No marble floors, no cold, modern emptiness. Just life. Grace caught him smiling, a rare, unguarded thing. Before he caught himself and looked away, they sat at her tiny kitchen table, nursing mugs of terrible instant coffee. For a while, neither spoke. Then Ethan said, almost to himself, "I never wanted you caught in this." Grace met his eyes across the table. "You didn't catch me," she said. "I chose to stand." Ethan leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You shouldn't have had to." The weight behind those words was heavy. Older than this fight, older than this company. Grace saw it now, saw the guilt he carried. Not just for her, but for all the things he hadn't saved before. "You can't protect everyone," she said gently. "You can only choose who you stand with." Their gazes locked, something raw and dangerous shimmering between them. For a moment, it felt inevitable. The shift from partnership to something deeper, something irreversibly human. But Ethan stood abruptly, breaking the moment. "Be careful," he said, voice tight. "They're not finished." Grace watched him go, her heart thudding painfully against her ribs. She knew he was right. The war wasn't over, it was only beginning, and this time they would both bleed for it. The days blurred into a constant low hum of tension. Grace went through the motions at Hayes Industries, but the walls were thinner now. Eyes followed her everywhere. Smiles came slower. Conversations paused when she entered a room. She had won the last battle. But wars, she was learning, had many fronts. Ethan became even more distant, more cautious, as if putting space between them could protect them both. Grace hated it, but understood. The closer they appeared, the bigger the target on her back became. Still, sometimes their eyes met across a crowded hallway, and something electric and unspoken passed between them. The external threats weren't idle either. Small sabotage escalated into larger, more dangerous moves. Misplaced reports, hacked, emails, deliberate scheduling errors. HR opened new investigations daily, fishing for anything that could be twisted into ammunition against her, and, by extension, against Ethan. One Thursday morning, Grace found a sealed envelope waiting. On her desk, legal, thick, heavy with consequences. Inside, a formal offer from an anonymous faction within the company. Walk away quietly, sign the agreement, receive a generous severance package. Never work in this city again if you refuse. She stared at the paper until her vision blurred. The message was clear: bow out or be destroyed. They weren't just threatening her career anymore. They were threatening her future, her independence, everything she had fought for since that first muddy day she ran through the rain. That evening, she found herself standing outside Ethan's office long after hours, debating whether to knock. She knew he was inside. The faint light under the door gave him away. Summoning courage she didn't feel, she tapped twice. A long silence, then, "Come in." Ethan sat behind his desk, sleeves rolled up, tie forgotten. He looked tired. Not the polished exhaustion of a CEO, but raw fatigue, the kind that burrowed, deep, and stayed. Grace closed the door and dropped the envelope on his desk. "They're giving me a choice," she said simply. Ethan didn't touch the envelope. He didn't need to. He understood the game without opening it. "What will you do?" he asked, voice low. Grace's throat tightened. "If I stay, they'll keep coming. If I go, I lose everything I've built." Ethan leaned back, studying her like a chess master facing an impossible move. "You've already won once," he said quietly. "You don't have to keep bleeding for this place." Grace shook her head. "It's not about the company. It's about not letting them decide my worth." For a moment, the air between them crackled with all the things they couldn't say. Finally, Ethan rose from his chair, walking around the desk until he stood a breath away. His hand hovered between them, inches from her shoulder before dropping. "Whatever you choose," he said, "I'll stand with you." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the first crack in his armor she'd ever seen. Grace's heart thundered. She wanted to reach out, to bridge the space between them, to erase the boundaries they'd both drawn in desperation and fear. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." 2 words, too small for what they carried. As she turned to leave, Ethan said her name, just once, softly. She stopped, waiting, hoping, dreading, but he said nothing more. And that somehow hurt worse than if he'd begged her to stay. She spent that night walking the city, the cold air biting into her skin, trying to make a decision that didn't feel like a loss no matter how she sliced it. Pride and fear warred inside her, trust and betrayal tangled like thorns. She thought of everything she'd already survived, everything she still wanted to build. By dawn, when the city blinked awake with headlights and delivery trucks and groggy commuters, Grace had her answer. She squared her shoulders, tucked the severance envelope into her bag, and walked toward Hayes Industries without looking back. Because survival was only step 1. Strength came next. And some battles were worth the scars they left behind. When Grace entered the building that morning, she felt it immediately. The shift in the air, the tightening of smiles, the way conversations faded to static when she passed. Hayes Industries wasn't just watching her now. It was judging her, measuring her defiance against their hunger for order. She ignored the stares, walked with her head high, and went straight to Ethan's office. He was already there, sifting through emails with a frown that didn't fade when she entered. Grace placed the unopened severance envelope on his desk. "My answer is no," she said simply. Ethan looked up slowly. For a moment, she thought she saw pride flicker behind his guarded expression. But it was quickly buried under something colder. Fear, maybe. Resignation. "Then you need to be ready," he said. "They won't stop until they break you. Or me." By midday, the first strike hit. An internal memo circulated, questioning Grace's competence. Subtle enough not to be libel, sharp enough to poison minds. She wasn't named outright, but everyone understood. Grace caught Eleanor's allies smirking in the halls, whispering behind elevator doors. The second strike came harder. Grace was pulled from key projects without explanation, reassigned to special assignments, meaningless busy work designed to sideline her. She worked twice as hard for half the recognition, pouring herself into invisible battles no one else bothered to fight. Ethan couldn't shield her anymore, not openly. He fought in his own way, maneuvering projects back into her hands, blocking more serious attacks. But each move he made cost him currency with the board. His empire, like hers, was starting to fray at the edges. One night, Grace found herself staring out her apartment window, exhausted beyond words. The city pulsed below, alive and indifferent. She wondered what it would feel like to disappear, to shed all the battles, all the pride, and just be anonymous again, safe, forgotten. The thought scared her more than the threats ever could. She wasn't built to vanish, she was built to endure. The next morning, she found a white rose on her desk, simple, stark against the mess of files. No note, no explanation, just a symbol. Resilience, survival. She didn't need to ask who had left it. Some things didn't require words. But resilience came at a price. Ethan missed 2 key meetings that week, something unheard of. Rumors spread like wildfire. The board was considering leadership restructuring. Investors grew twitchy. The empire Ethan had built was slipping through his fingers, and she was the weight tied to his ankles. One evening, after a brutal day of silent warfare, Grace caught Ethan staring out his office window, a rare look of real defeat on his face. She stood in the doorway, heart aching. "Maybe I should go," she said softly, "before it's too late for you." Ethan turned, and the pain in his eyes stole her breath. "It was already too late for me," he said, "long before you ever walked through those doors." His voice cracked, a fault line opening wide. "At least with you, it means something." Grace didn't answer. She couldn't. The lump in her throat was too thick. She simply walked forward and laid her hand on his, anchoring him, if only for a moment. It was all they could give each other in a world that demanded everything and left nothing behind. That night, Grace made a decision she never thought she'd have to face. She started packing her desk quietly, without telling Ethan. Not because she was giving up, but because sometimes love meant stepping away so the other person could survive, even if it broke both of them in the process. The first day without Grace felt like a bad dream Ethan couldn't wake from. Her desk sat empty, stripped of life. No coffee mug, no scribbled notes, no battered notebooks stacked precariously high. Just an abandoned chair and a hollow space no amount of work could fill. The company kept moving, of course. Meetings were held, deals were signed, memos were sent. Business as usual. But beneath the surface, something vital had gone missing. The sharpness of innovation, the quiet defiance that once pushed Hayes Industries to greatness, all of it dulled now. Ethan tried to drown himself in the endless tide of tasks. He buried himself under contracts, proposals, quarterly forecasts. He answered every email personally, attended every meeting, smiled through every investor call. But it didn't matter. The gears turned slower. The empire was bleeding momentum. The board moved quickly. An emergency session was called under the guise of strategic redirection. Ethan sat through it in silence, listening to veiled accusations and polite betrayals. They talked about fresh leadership and adaptability as if he were already a relic they had decided to discard. At night, his penthouse was unbearably quiet. No more texts from Grace with sarcastic commentary about office politics. No more late-night email corrections. Only she would dare send him. Just silence, and the cold hum of the city pressing against the windows like a second skin. Sometimes he caught himself reaching for his phone, half dialing her number before stopping. What could he say? "I'm sorry you had to leave to save me. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to protect you." Words were weapons Ethan knew how to wield in business. But not here. Not where it mattered. One evening, long past midnight, Ethan stood at the rooftop of Hayes Tower, looking down at the sprawling city. It glittered and pulsed, beautiful and ruthless. Somewhere out there, Grace was carving a new path. He envied her courage, envied her ability to walk away from everything when he was still shackled to it. He thought of her laughter, rare and real. He thought of the way she challenged him, made him better without ever asking for anything in return. He thought of the rose he left on her desk, a small, stupid gesture, and wondered if she kept it. At the next board meeting, Ethan didn't fight when they proposed interim leadership oversight. He didn't argue when they demanded quarterly progress updates micromanaged by a strategic committee. He just signed the documents, every stroke of the pen carving deeper into the empire he had built with blood and sleepless nights. People said grief was loud, a wailing, ripping thing. But losing Grace felt more like suffocation, slow, silent, inescapable. Every day without her was a day the building grew colder, the walls closing in a little tighter. He saw her once, accidentally, 3 weeks after she left. She was in a small cafe downtown, laughing with a group of young entrepreneurs. She looked lighter somehow, freer. She didn't see him, or if she did, she chose not to acknowledge it. Ethan turned away before his chest could shatter under the weight of regret. That night, back in his empty penthouse, he opened a blank email draft and just stared at it. No words came. Nothing felt right. Nothing felt enough. How do you apologize to someone you should never have hurt? How do you tell someone they were the only thing that made this life worth living? The truth was brutal in its simplicity. Without Grace, Hayes Industries could survive. But Ethan Hayes could not. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the city's cold light pour over him, whispering a truth he could no longer ignore. If he wanted to find her again, if he wanted to deserve her, he would have to tear down the walls he spent a lifetime building. And he would have to do it before it was too late. The first weeks outside Hayes Industries felt like learning how to breathe again. Grace woke up without alarms, screaming in her ear, without meetings crowding her calendar, without the constant pressure of invisible knives pointed at her back. At first, it felt like freefall, then like freedom. She started small. A freelance project here, a consulting call there. Bit by bit, she built a new reputation, not under the shadow of a corporation, but by her own merit. Clients came hesitantly. At first, then steadily, word spread. Grace Bennett didn't just survive storms, she thrived because of them. Her new office was nothing more than a tiny co-working space downtown, shared with other scrappy entrepreneurs trying to outrun the world's indifference. She loved it. The chaos, the noise, the smell of burnt coffee and ambition. It was raw and imperfect and hers. One afternoon, as she sipped lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug, she received an email from a major non-profit organization. They wanted her to consult on a rebranding project. A big one, enough to put her new company on the map. Grace smiled. At the screen, heart pounding. This was it, her new beginning. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan Hayes stared at the ruins of what used to be his empire. On the surface, Hayes Industries still thrived, stocks remained steady, clients stayed loyal, but inside, the soul of the company had eroded, replaced by fear and micromanagement. He moved through meetings like a ghost, delivering victories that tasted like ashes. Every win felt hollow without someone to share it with. Every decision weighed heavier now, lacking the sharp, honest voice that once kept him grounded. He hated what he had become. One night, sitting alone in his darkened office, Ethan opened a drawer he hadn't touched in months. Inside was a small card, the quote Grace had once left him, "In a room full of echoes, be the voice that doesn't fade." He ran his fingers over the words, feeling their truth cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal. He realized then, in the brutal honesty of solitude, that he hadn't fought for Grace. Not really. He had fought to protect his position, his image, his control. And by doing so, he had lost the one thing that had ever made all of it worthwhile. Change wouldn't come from boardroom battles or strategic plays. It would come from tearing down everything that had kept him armored and alone for so long. It would come from humility, from vulnerability. Two things Ethan Hayes had spent a lifetime avoiding. The next morning, he began making calls. He started delegating real authority to people who deserved it, dismantling the culture of fear Eleanor had carefully cultivated. He sat through uncomfortable meetings, apologized without excuses, admitted where he had failed. It wasn't easy. Every instinct screamed against it. But little by little, the company began to breathe again. Not because of him, but because he finally stopped choking the life out of it. And then he turned his attention to the harder task, finding Grace. Not to beg her to come back, not to offer her a better job, a bigger title, or a grand gesture wrapped in guilt. No, he needed to find her as a man, not as a CEO, and ask honestly if there was still something left between them worth saving. Grace was sitting at her usual cafe when he found her. No bodyguards, no tailored suits, just Ethan, in jeans and a simple jacket, looking like someone who had finally remembered how to be human. He didn't approach immediately. He just watched her for a moment, drinking in the sight of the woman he had almost lost forever. Finally, he stepped forward, heart hammering harder than any board presentation ever had. Grace looked up, surprise flashing across her face, but not anger, not fear, just curiosity, as if wondering what version of Ethan Hayes was standing in front of her now. "Can I sit?" he asked quietly. Grace considered him for a long moment, then nodded. No promises, no guarantees, just an open door, small but real, and for the first time in a very long time, Ethan stepped through without hesitation. They sat in silence at the tiny table, the city bustling just beyond the cafe windows. Grace stirred her coffee absently, as if buying time, while Ethan gripped his cup too tightly, as if it were the only thing anchoring him in place. Neither seemed sure who should speak first. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I don't want anything from you," he said, voice low. "Not a contract, not forgiveness, not even closure if you don't want to give it. I just needed you to know that I'm trying to be better, even if you never see it." Grace tilted her head slightly, studying him. This was not the Ethan Hayes she had faced across polished boardrooms. This was a man stripped of armor, a man whose words shook not because he was weak, but because he was finally honest. "You hurt me," she said simply, no anger in her tone, just fact. Ethan flinched but didn't look away. "I know," he said, "and I'm sorry. Not for what I lost, for what I made you lose." Grace sipped her coffee, letting the words settle between them like dust. "What made you come here?" she asked, voice soft but firm. Ethan leaned forward slightly, elbows on the worn tabletop. "Because surviving without you wasn't enough," he said. "Because building something without heart isn't building anything at all. I forgot that." Grace looked out the window, watching a mother and child pass by, their laughter lost to the glass. "And if I say I'm happy where I am," she asked, "that I'm not the same girl who needed your approval anymore?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Then I'll be proud of you, even if it breaks me." The rawness of his admission cut deeper than any accusation could have. Grace closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of the years, the battles, the choices they both carried like scars under their skin. "I'm not coming back," she said, voice steady. "Not to the company." "I didn't come to ask you to," Ethan said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. An old-fashioned letter, handwritten. He slid it across the table without meeting her eyes. "This is everything I never said, everything I was too proud or too afraid to say." Grace didn't touch it. Not yet. She stared at it, the paper trembling slightly in the air between them. A small, simple thing that carried the weight of 1,000 silent apologies. "What if I can't forgive you?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then I'll live with that," he said. "But I'll never stop being grateful you were brave enough to walk away. You saved me, Grace, even if you didn't mean to." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away. She was not the same woman who had once begged for scraps of respect. She was stronger now, wiser. But strength didn't mean shutting every door. Sometimes it meant finding the courage to open one again. She picked up the letter, folding it carefully into her bag without reading it yet. "I'll think about it," she said. "About everything." Ethan smiled then, a small, broken thing that somehow made him look younger, almost boyish. "That's all I can ask." They stood awkwardly, the moment stretching between them. Grace extended her hand first, professional but warm. Ethan hesitated for a split second before taking it. His grip was firm but not possessive, an offer, not a claim. As they stepped back into the flow of the city, Grace felt the sun warm her face for the first time in what felt like years. She didn't know where the road would lead from here. She only knew she wasn't walking it alone anymore. Not unless she chose to. And for the first time in a very long time, that choice was hers to make. Days passed before Grace found the courage to open the letter. She sat at her kitchen table, the city glowing outside her window, the paper trembling slightly. In her hands, she unfolded it slowly, as if bracing for an impact she couldn't quite predict. The handwriting was neat but unpracticed, each word deliberate. Ethan had written about mistakes, not just the ones he made with her, but the ones that shaped him long before they met, losing his brother, building walls instead of bridges. Choosing pride over people. "I built an empire because I was too afraid to build a life," he had written. "You showed me there's more strength in vulnerability than in power. You made me remember who I wanted to be before the world taught me to be afraid." Grace read it twice, then 3 times, tears blurring the words. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't poetry, but it was real. And real was what she had always wanted, more than grand gestures, more than empty promises. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into its envelope. Then she picked up her phone and typed a simple message. "Tomorrow, noon, same cafe." No explanations, no expectations. Just a door left ajar. When she arrived the next day, Ethan was already there, sitting at their old table, nervously, tapping his fingers against the chipped wood. He looked up when she entered, his eyes filled with 1,000 silent questions and 1,000 silent hopes. Grace slid into the seat across from him, heart pounding but steady. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Grace smiled, small, genuine, devastating. "You still owe me a decent cup of coffee," she said lightly. Ethan laughed, a sound rough with emotion, and waved the barista over. As they sipped fresh coffee, better this time but still terrible, Grace leaned forward, resting her chin on her hand. "So," she said, "what now?" Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and for once didn't offer a plan, a contract, or a strategy. Instead, he said simply, "We start with one step, and we don't rush it." Grace nodded slowly, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. "I can live with that." For the first time, they were building something not out of desperation or survival, but out of choice. They spent the afternoon wandering the city, talking about nothing and everything. Ethan told her stories he had never shared, about his brother, about the loneliness money couldn't buy away. Grace told him about her childhood dreams, the ones she had buried under the weight of adulthood. As the sun dipped below the skyline, they found themselves on a rooftop overlooking the glowing city. Ethan turned to her, hands shoved deep into his pockets, expression raw. "I'm not promising it'll be easy," he said. "I'm a work in progress." Grace stepped closer, so close their shoulders brushed. "So am I," she said. And for once that wasn't a confession of failure. It was a celebration of survival. They stood there in silence, the city humming below them, the future stretching out uncertain and infinite. No guarantees, no perfect endings. Just two people who had learned, through pain and loss, that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about learning how to rise again, together. And as they leaned into each other, smiling against the weight of the world, it was clear. Some stories didn't start with a kiss or a grand confession or even a promise. Some stories started with a fall and became flight. Wow, what a story, right? I'd love to hear what you thought. Drop a comment, rate it from 1 to 10 and tell me where you're watching from. And hey, don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories we have on the channel. There's so much more waiting for you.